The Anglo-Saxon Chronicle recorded that in the year 865, this year sat the heathen army in the Isle of Thanet, and made peace with men of Kent, who promised money therewith, but under the security of peace and the promise of money, the army in the night stole up the country, and overran all Kent eastward. Called the Great Heathen Army, the Great Viking Army, or simply the Great Armies, large forces of Vikings terrorised the British Isles, Frankia and beyond during the later part of the 9th century. For historians, the Great Armies have long been a point of contention to do with their size, motivations and tactics. Some historians have even argued that great armies cannot be considered armies at all, but instead should be viewed as smaller fighting bands. Despite the contestation, the continued interest in the Viking great armies are a testament to their significance. But what truly makes the Great Viking Armies great? Join me in today's video as we unravel this complex question. Greatness is defined by Merriam-Webster Dictionary as being remarkable in magnitude and effectiveness. Thus, the Viking great armies can be seen as great because of their size and capacity as a military force. Although it has previously been debated, most historians now agree that the great armies numbered in the thousands. This is highlighted by the camps of the great armies, which have been uncovered in archaeological digs. Torksey is an example of this. It is located in Lincolnshire and was used by the great armies in the winter of 872 to 873. Archaeologists have found that the site is over 30 hectares, making it bigger than some Scandinavian towns such as Birka and Hedeby. In many ways, the greatness of the Viking armies can be seen as rooted in their military might, as well as their sheer size. The Vikings did not adhere to typical ritualized expectations of warfare, and instead remained flexible. The Vikings adopted a variety of techniques, such as hit-and-run style raiding, shield walls and fortified overwinter camps. Torksey itself was located in a strategic position on the River Trent, in a defendable position, on high ground and surrounded by areas which would flood in the winter. It also has various resources around which help supply the Great Army's men. Furthermore, the successes of the Great Army was down to the Vikings' pragmatism and military tactics. For example, in Frankia, the Vikings exploited Frankia's river system for raiding, and like Torksey, established a strategic base camp on an island in the Loire. They also acted both as raiders and hired mercenaries in Frankia, which allowed them to pivot between positions depending on which was most profitable. These tactics allowed the Vikings to extract 7 million silver pennies from Frankia in the 9th century, an estimated 14% of the kingdom's total monetary output. Overall, the Vikings had a level of military specialism when compared to their opponents. The language contemporaries use to describe the Vikings highlight this. The Anglo-Saxon Chronicle called the great armies the Mickle here, despite the word fjord being used to describe Saxon armies. This suggests that the great armies were markedly different from the defensive armies they faced, because they were composed of professional warriors who had been trained and armed to a high standard. The Saxon armies, in contrast, had an entirely different structure. There was a small section which was composed of household guards, but the majority was made up of the fjord, a mass of farmers and other non-warriors who were called upon by their lords in service in battle. This gave the Vikings a significant advantage against such fjords in battles such as the Battle of Reading in 871, in which an army of West Saxons led by King Ethelred and his brother Alfred was defeated by an army made up of the Vikings. Thus, the military superiority and overall tactical mindset of the great armies enabled their great status. However, to truly understand the Viking great armies, greatness must be defined beyond the army's fighting ability. The Viking armies thus were great because of the political consequences of their invasions, with armies becoming a power force in both Saxon and Frankish dynastic struggles. They had the ability to threaten, form and dissolve established political units, which made the great armies truly great. Perhaps the biggest example of the political impact of the great armies is how they destabilised the Anglo-Saxon kingdoms from 865 onwards. After their initial landing in Thanet, the first real phases of conquest began with East Anglia, as the army massed in the kingdom and forced the Saxons into giving them supplies. Using the horses taken from the East Anglians, the great armies went to Northumbria and took the city of York. Embroiled in a civil war between claimants to the throne, Aella and Osbert, Northumbria offered little resistance and the Vikings had control of the kingdom by 876. The Great Army also turned their attention back to East Anglia and brought the area fully into their control when they killed the king Edmund. In 871, the Great Army overwintered in London and then began to subjugate parts of the kingdom of Mercia, and they even installed a puppet king called Ceolwulf. In just over a decade, the Great Army had subjugated 3 of the 4 Saxon kingdoms. This is significant because the Great Armies destabilized the established balance of power between the Saxon kingdoms, which had been in place for hundreds of years. In the long term, however, the Great Viking Armies also had an impact in the politics of kingdoms beyond this. In many ways, they even aided kingdom making, as is highlighted in the formation of England. Most obviously, the Viking conquest created the conditions for the Wessex dynasty to unite the other kingdoms under their influence. This happened through the reconquering of the Danelaw. The Danelaw was a region of land given to the Vikings in a peace treaty between Alfred the Great and Guthrum in 878. This reconquest was used as a means to establish the Wessex line as the overkings of the Saxon kingdoms. This especially happened in the reign of Edward the Elder and Ethelfled. Together, they captured areas such as East Anglia, the East Midlands and Essex, and fortified the areas under their control through the use of burhs, which were fortified fortresses and towns. In more subtle ways, the Great Army was also vital to the creation of the English social and political identity. This is because the Vikings acted as an enemy of the Saxons through their differences in culture, as well as the threat that their raiding and military activity had on the Saxon people. As Sarah Foote argues, this enabled different regions and kingdoms to unite through a shared history, common faith, and other English cultural similarities. This is highlighted through Alfred the Great's educational reforms, as well as the written output which came from this era in the English language. Various vernacular translations appeared, such as Pope Gregory's Pastoral Care, which Alfred himself even translated in 893. Some law codes were also even written in English. Therefore, the Great Armies can be seen as great in this aspect, because deliberately or inadvertently they reshaped the political contours of the places they passed through. However, the Viking armies also had an impact beyond politics. Social and cultural changes also occurred in the land that they invaded because of the interactions which the Vikings had with local communities. In this way, the greatness of the Viking armies lies in their social experiments which brought new perspectives to people who they interacted with. For example, the Viking camp in Torksey marked the reintroduction of the pottery wheel for the first time since the collapse of Roman Britannia, which shows how the Viking armies enabled the reinvigoration of previously dormant technologies. Similarly, the Viking armies opened trade routes to the Saxons, as is shown by finds in York, with traces of Byzantine silks and a cowrie shell from the Red Sea found in archaeological digs. However, the great social changes triggered by the Viking armies went much deeper. Through a process of social integration, Members of the Great Army acquired land and settled into the English communities. The result of this was the creation of a distinct hybrid Anglo-Scandinavian identity, which pervaded nearly all areas of life. For instance, there were significant changes to material culture, as is highlighted by disc brooches, which were found in York and East Anglia, which fused Viking styles with Anglo-Saxon styles. Linguistic changes also occurred, as is reflected in naming patterns of both place and people. Over 210 place names in Yorkshire have Viking origins, for example. Furthermore, by the 11th century, 50% of personal names in Cheshire were of Scandinavian origin, as is shown in the Domesday Book. This change even seeped into belief systems, as is highlighted by a coin found in York, which depict both a cross and Thor's hammer. This suggests that there was a marrying of pagan and Christian beliefs by the residents of Jorvik and similar areas where Vikings and Anglo-Saxons had settled together. Hence, Viking armies were great, as their socio-cultural influence enmeshed into the very fabric of England, something which has endured until modern times. The nature of Viking armies in many ways still is unresolved, but their greatness is clear, and it is also something which is highly multifaceted. The Viking armies drew their greatness from their military prowess and superior fighting forces, which enabled domination over their foes. In many ways, tactical pragmatism created a legacy for Viking armies, who had repeated battle victories. However, greatness rests on achievements beyond military successes. The Great Army's legacy is social, political and cultural too. It is clear that by the end of the 9th century that the Vikings had worked their way into the very heart of England. Their culture, political impact, linguistic impact and other aspects had worked into the very bones of England. Overall, the greatness of the armies was in their ability to not only act as armies, but also to act as a social collective, which was always evolving, interacting, changing and influencing. Hi there, thank you so much for watching this video. If you enjoyed, please consider liking and subscribing. I also have an Instagram and a TikTok page which I have linked below. Again, thank you so much for watching. I have been Our Historia, and until next time.